Ja meie järgmise paneeli küsimusteks on, kas inimõiguste vaba languses ja kas siis on Euroopa põhiõigused kriisi lävel. Ja seda vestlust juhib Katre Luhamaa, Tartu Ülikooli õppejõud ja palun, pult on teie.
Good afternoon, and I'm happy that so many of you have decided to come and stay and listen to our second panel. And the title of it is Europe on the Brink of a Fundamental Rights Crisis, Are Human Rights in Downfall? And when thinking of the issue, then I was able to identify perhaps 3 layers where these topics and issues can be discussed. Firstly, human rights and the European Union. There are a number of states in the EU who are limiting the rights of both their citizens as well as non-citizens. And the reasons for these limitations are national security concerns, terrorism, or sometimes also populism. There is even further human rights crisis in some of the member states of the EU, where there are tendencies to limit the work of the judiciary, where there is tendency to limit further human rights speech as well as freedom of expression. Second layer that you could identify is a wider Europe. And wider Europe has to cope with several challenges that are quite often connected to certain member states of the Council of Europe. There is continuing limitation of implementation of human rights decisions by the European Court of Human Rights in some of the member states. You see reluctance of the states in applying the fundamental values that we have in the Council of Europe and under the European Convention on Human Rights. And furthermore, the membership fees of a number of member states to the Council of Europe have not been paid in last years. So actually the human rights work is being threatened by a number of member states, and many activities that the Council of Europe does have been thus limited. The third level is the global level. And when looking at the United Nations, then you would clearly see how European values as well as European member states are being downvoted by, let's take some examples, by some more southern and eastern states. For example, the Human Rights Council has adopted Traditional Values Declaration. They have adopted also Declaration on the Family Values. And you see that there are a number of issues where Western states have been in a minority, and the values that we thought were universal have been redefined, or there are at least attempts to redefine them. I now invite all the panelists to the floor. Please. And we have a really interesting mix here. We have some government representatives, we have a judge, we have representatives of NGOs. And I will give a short introduction to each and every one of them prior to their own small introductory speeches. So our first panelist that will get the floor is Mr. Francois Zimmer, and he's French ambassador to Denmark. He has served as French ambassador at large for human rights and participated in numerous missions around the world. He has also been a member of the European Parliament and served as a major. Professionally, he's a lawyer, and among other positions, he is also a member of the International Criminal Bar of The Hague and calls himself a human rights activist. In 2015, he survived a terror shooting in Copenhagen while participating in a debate about the freedom of expression. and he has also written a book about his experience and conflicting feelings on the topic. So please, Francois, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour. Mrs. President, Excellencies, Madame l'Ambassadeur, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's a great pleasure and a great privilege for me to be here. Thank you for having invited me, and I'm very impressed by this very large event on human rights, and I really congratulate all the organizers and partners. In fact, I'm not supposed to speak English except as a French official, except with a strong French accent, so I will do my best for that. The title of this panel is quite provocative, and I think it's extremely appropriate. And I thank you for that as well. I think that freedom and provocation is a good couple, and one should not separate this couple, because freedom goes with provocation as well. I believe in symbols, and for me it's not insignificant to underline the fact that we are soon, in 2018, it will be the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's a good opportunity to see where we are 70 years after this declaration has been adopted in December in 1948 in Paris. And for that, I think I would like to make two short clarifications. The first one is on the very concept of human rights, because words have not the same meaning depending on the person who listens them. And when you say in the public human rights, generally people, they listen, they hear moral values, and they expect from politicians statements, symbols. And I have to say very clearly that for me, human rights are not moral, are not values. They are not something in the lofty ideal. Human rights are rights that exist or don't exist, that are enforced or violated. They are rights and human realities, men, women, and children. So we are not in the lofty ideals. We are not, it's not a kind of religion that goes like that, abstract in the air. It's very concrete realities that we address with violations, with suffering, and I think that's very, and these rights, as all rights, are the fruit of compromises, so they are not perfect. This was my first remark. My second remark is regarding the universality. Talking about universality of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The only text which revendicates in its title this very notion of universality. What does it mean? I think that the best definition is the one which exists in the preamble of the Universal Declaration when René Cassin speaks about the famille humaine, the human family. The idea that whatever could be our differences, our origins, our religions, our latitudes, we belong to the same family. We are all brothers in humanity. It's a strong idea that we have to cherish and to protect. And I think that this idea now is setting back. It is threatened. Universality is threatened everywhere. It is threatened in our societies when people advocate for double standards, for parallel societies. It is threatened in the world where in some countries, in some regions, people call for some specific values that should not apply to all. It's threatened every time when people say, okay, you have your own human rights, but in our culture, in our tradition, they should not apply the same way. And I think we have to bring an answer to this attempt. And the battlefront, the battle line, the front line of this battle is, of course, UN, Geneva, New York, the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, and our diplomacy, they fight very hard, and the European diplomacy, to defend this very notion of universality. And we have to bring an answer. And the answer should not be political, should not be philosophical, but very concrete. Everything I have seen, and it will be my last word for this introduction, everything I have seen in the mission I've accomplished in the world, visiting victims of violations in all continents, 127 missions. When I think to all the person I met, I realize that there are no different ways to suffer from torture depending on your culture, of your religion. There is no place in the world where someone accepts to be put in a jail without a fair trial. There is no woman who considers that it's normal to be raped because this is a local custom or this is her condition. So it's not human right as an abstract concept which are universals. It's mankind which is universal, and man's suffering which is universal, and man's aspirations for dignity which is universal. And when I think to all these faces I've seen, I met during these years, it's exactly as I've seen only one person, because it's the same face. They talk about their suffering with the same words. So we have to be strong advocates of this notion of universality, which I think is very endangered these days. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So you point out that human rights are not perfect, but they are actionable tools. They are something that one can use, as well as the point on universalities is very well taken. What is this universality that we are talking about? How does it relate? Does it relate to rights, or does it relate to humankind? And this was a very interesting point. Our second speaker is Jacob Mchangama. Sorry, I have tried to pronounce it for a long time at night, and still I get it wrong. I'm so sorry, Jacob. He is a Danish lawyer and legal advisor, as well as human rights expert. He founded Justitia, a think tank that deals with human rights and laws. And he has also dealt with international human rights issues at the University of Copenhagen. Please, Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to the beautiful city of Tallinn. It's an honor and a privilege to be here in this room with all of you. With the collapse of communism, freedom of expression experienced exponential growth on the European continent. People that were liberated from the physical and mental prisons of totalitarianism reveled in the fresh air of free discourse. Singing in public was no longer against the law. But the honeymoon was short-lived, because since 2004, the respect for freedom of expression has been in decline globally as well as in Europe, which I think means we are living in the midst of a paradox, because never before have we been able to communicate so fast, freely, and widely before as we have now. Now, if you go back 6 or 7 years ago, there was a stark difference between how democracies and autocracies reacted to this development. Democracies would celebrate the digital revolution as a triumph. They would see it as a vindication of the values of the open society. But today, things have changed. Instead of autocracies becoming more like democracies, democracies are starting to copy-paste from the playbook of autocracy, pushed by the threats of terrorism, hate speech, and most recently, state-sponsored propaganda and dissemination of false information. A few examples. In Germany, social media companies can be fined up to 50 million euro if they fail to remove illegal content. In my home country, Denmark, condoning illegal acts can send you to prison for up to 3 years if done as part of religious teaching. In the UK, viewing terrorist content online may soon send you to prison for 15 years. Spain's crackdown on peaceful protest in Catalonia is another worrying example. And there are strong voices in European governments, as well as some in the EU, that have suggested banning so-called fake news. Outside the EU, things are not looking better. 10 or 15 years ago, some thought that Russia would move towards democracy and the rule of law. Turkey would be a bridgehead of democracy and human rights into the wider Middle East. But today, Putin and Erdogan are competing to see who can offer the least hospitable environment for free and independent journalism. I think Erdogan is in the lead, but I would never underestimate Putin. But why should we care more about free expression than other rights under threat in an increasingly illiberal world? The American founder, Benjamin Franklin, famously said, "Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech." And I think that history proves Franklin right. The first anti-democratic coups in the history of mankind took place in 411 and 404 BC, when the Athenian democracy was overthrown by oligarchs, democrats were murdered, and democratic institutions crushed. And when Athenian democracy died finally in 322, it would take more than 2,000 years before democracy and free speech were revived as supreme ideals. Last month was the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. One of the very first moves of Lenin was to issue a decree of 9th November that gave the Council of People's Commissars the right to ban newspapers. Newspapers were, in Lenin's words, no less dangerous than bombs or machine guns. Of course, this temporary measure meant the death of free speech for more than 7 decades in the Soviet Union. And these are just a few of many, many historical examples that demonstrate how a country's commitment to free speech is a very reliable barometer of its commitment to human rights as such. And without free speech, it becomes impossible to advance other rights or causes. Whether you want to advance the right of the LGBTI community, counter racism, combat global climate change, or expose corruption, free speech is the necessary precondition. Without it, those in power can shape political opinion as they want, and citizens are powerless to speak truth against power, mobilize social movements, create vibrant civil societies, and cast light on abuse and corruption. That's why the denial of freedom of expression and opinion was among the very first complaints of the famous Charter 77, so influential in advancing the case for dissidents behind the Iron Curtain. And it's why there can be little hope for progress in Turkey or Russia without the means of criticizing those in power. How can Amnesty, for instance, fight for any rights in Turkey when its director was imprisoned for speaking out? But even in liberal democracies, there are many who want to limit free speech for important and noble causes, racism being one, extremism another, and fake news, just to mention a few of very real problems. But addressing them through restrictions on free speech leads down a very dangerous path. Not only do we rock the foundations of open societies, but we also legitimate the draconian measures of authoritarian states. Take the issue of fake news. As I said, there have been those in the EU and European member states that have floated the idea of banning fake news. Under the threat from constant Russian propaganda, Ukraine and Lithuania have already taken drastic steps, such as banning Russian TV stations. But from the perspective of international human rights, this is a deeply problematic move. For who gets to decide what news are fake, what is propaganda and what is not? Lenin's decree from 1917 banned slanderous distortion of facts, which of course meant everything that Lenin would disagree with. And on several occasions, US President Trump has threatened the media with consequences, citing exactly fake news. Can anyone doubt that without the strong protection of free speech in the US Constitution, Trump would have tried to limit criticism of himself and his administration? And on terrorism, the problem is identical. In Denmark, terrorism may be liking a Facebook account from the Islamic State. In Russia, it may be claiming that Crimea is part of Ukraine on VKontakte. So if we want to reverse the decline of free speech and thereby strengthen the overall fight for human rights, we will have to fight for free speech on principle, not expediency. And that means defending, in the words of George Orwell, the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. I think that you very well identified through the prism of free speech how it can be a barometer for the state and for the human rights state in these countries. Our next speaker is Nele Parrest. She is Justice of Administrative Law Chamber of the Supreme Court of Estonia, and she has previously worked as a Deputy Chancellor of Justice, and she has also worked at the as the departmental head of the Office of the Chancellor of Justice. Also, perhaps is worth mentioning that she has worked in the Ministry of Justice and as Public Law Division head of it. Thank you, Nele. Sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, In legal theory, there is a saying that the best norms are those norms that correspond to the needs of the particular time, of the particular place. Human rights are abstract, open-ended, in a positive sense, notions which presume interpretation and balancing depending on a concrete situation. Hence, human rights are good norms, as they give the possibility to find the best, the justice, the most just solution in a concrete situation. As social circumstances are changing, it's clear that the understanding of human rights is also in a constant development. Whether this is what is going on at the moment, whether this is in a positive or in a negative direction, it's hard to say. It's probably up to future generations to look back and decide on it. But as long as this development is the reflection of democratic changes in the society and corresponds to the needs of the particular time and of the particular place, it is okay. It is clear that in times of emergency, more stringent, intensive restrictions to human rights are allowed than in times of peace and harmony. So, from this point of view, in my opinion, we are not in the human rights crisis at the moment. But I am worried, and I still have to admit that yes, we are on the doorway of human rights crisis. Namely, interpreting and making a balancing test while we are restricting human rights in order to find the most just, the justice solution depends on a decision maker. Who is the ultimate decision maker? A judge. A judge who has to adjudicate in a concrete case. A judge who has the power in many countries to be or to have the so-called the role of negative legislator, with the right to overturn laws adopted by the parliament in case the parliament has stepped over the boundaries of right and wrong. More and more we hear attacks against judges, attacks against independence of judiciary and courts. Turkey, Poland, Hungary, recently, unfortunately, also Bulgaria. Curtailing the guarantees of courts and judiciary by the legislator is not the only possibility to hamper the work of courts. The other is lack of resources, which causes work overload, excessive time limits. Late justice is no justice, as the well-known sentence says, which also undermines the trust of the society towards courts, towards the state. There is no one to turn anymore. And I'm not saying all this because I'm a judge and I feel sorry for my colleagues. No, independence of courts and judiciary is the most important factor to guarantee that despite what happens in the society, the right balancing test is made while the human rights are restricted. The most just, the justice solution is found. Courts are the ultimate guarantees that we will not end up in human rights crisis where no exit exists. But to end up with more positive tone, I would still want to bring out that we also live quite in an interesting time, as we can more and more see the new evolution of human rights. More and more we talk about the right to good administration, the right to internet, the right to poor environment, the right to refugee status on the basis of environmental needs. All these developments show that human rights were, are, and will be important as abstract, open-ended notions they evolve together with the society. Thank you.
Thank you, Nele, for stressing the importance of free judiciary for the human rights protection. And also, I think that your last remark about widening the scope of human rights and including new human rights into the agenda is perhaps one of the issues that the panel should tackle later on, whether it is useful to extend the human rights language to all kinds of rights and where should the limits lie. Our fourth speaker is David Griffiths. You have met her already in the morning. He's head of the Office of the Secretary General at Amnesty International, and there he shapes the agenda of the Secretary General. He previously led the South Asia regional team of Amnesty and managed the transition from London into the region. Before joining Amnesty, he worked in research and advocacy to promote rights of religious, ethnic, and caste minorities in Asia. So please, David, the floor is yours.
Madam President, Your Excellencies, friends, I'm afraid it's me again. And I stand here as, with a couple of caveats. So the first is that I'm afraid I'm not a Europe specialist, so I hope you will forgive me any failures or gaps in my analysis as such. The second, of course, is that I'm painfully aware as a UK passport holder standing here talking about the future of Europe that there's a significant irony to all of this, so I'd ask you to overlook that as well. But I do believe that we're at a moment, a historical juncture now, where Europe must confront the question of what it wants to be. What kind of societies, as European societies, do we want to be? Now, of course, there was an assumption back in the 1990s that the pendulum, as it were, of democracy, of rights, of the rule of law would swing from west to east. And the Council of Europe, which Katre mentioned in her introduction a few moments ago, is, of course, part of that aspiration, part of that equation. But the Council of Europe has struggled to be two things, both a setter and upholder of norms, and also fostering and assisting democratic transitions in the East. And this sort of institutional challenge is, I think, part of a wider malaise, wider challenge that Europe faces around the question of its identity. And we see now how the pendulum is moving from east to west in some respects. The context for this is complex, I know, and part of it is about Russia and Turkey pushing back against Europeanization, against that project, which is interpreted by some within the EU as a pushback against Europe's values. There is a question of how much this is about values and how much it's about politics. But irrespective of that, I think it's clear for all to see that values and rights in Europe, in the EU, are under attack, as indeed, as my colleagues have elaborated before me, in Russia and Turkey. And I just want to set out very briefly some of the key challenges that I think we need to be discussing with regard to Europe now. The first is around migration and refugees. I spoke a little about this earlier, but the paradigm, the dominant paradigm in Europe when it comes to refugees and to asylum seekers is simply pushing away at any cost. Europe has not been willing to grapple with the bigger global challenge of regulating migration safely and legally. Indeed, we now have a situation where pretty much anything goes. The abuses in Libya, the way that the Coast Guard system there has been supported by the EU and responsible for some extraordinary abuses, as indeed in the detention center in Libya, detention centers, is just one vignette of that. The EU-Turkey deal, of course, was a forerunner of what we're seeing in Libya today, working with the pretense that Turkey is a safe country for refugees. This kind of abusive policy making is accepted and normal within Europe. And indeed, we're seeing increasing and significant questioning of the Refugee Convention, which Europe was instrumental in creating. The second area is around counterterrorism. And I mentioned earlier the sort of Faustian bargain, exchanging security for rights. And I think we've seen leaders in Europe persuading or seeking to persuade European populations that it's acceptable to redraw the boundaries on issues such as privacy, preventative detention, and other restrictions on personal liberty and on freedoms of assembly and association. And if we're not careful, we'll see how these hard-won safeguards, hard-won freedoms will gradually erode, and we may, in Europe, find ourselves in a situation that we very much don't want to be in. The third area is around human rights defenders and civil society. Of course, we're accustomed to, sadly, seeing significant attacks on the right to dissent and on journalists, particularly in the East, in Russia and in Turkey, as Jakob elaborated a little earlier on. But we're also seeing this within the EU now, and I refer particularly to Hungary. The Lex NGO recently, the law on foreign funding for NGOs, was introduced in a context where many organizations were criticized as undermining the sovereignty of Hungary if they receive foreign funding. And in that context, legislation has been introduced requiring all such NGOs to put on the front cover of publications that they're funded that they receive foreign funding. It's a clear attempt to discredit and undermine the voices of civil society. And this attack on civic space, which we've seen in many other countries across the world, has a deeply damaging effect, and Europe needs to confront the fact that this is happening now within the EU. And fourthly, the question of economic and social rights. Significant challenges arising from people's experiences of economic austerity and anxieties around work, homes, etc. This has been exploited ruthlessly by so-called populist politicians in the past couple of years, particularly linking people's legitimate anxieties to questions of migration and security, which don't provide real answers to the challenges that people feel. And a lot of leaders in Europe have allowed the populists to set the agenda. Where are the positive narratives articulating a different vision for the future of Europe coming from? And so I would argue this is a time for Europe to rediscover and to re-articulate its foundational values, to put forth a propositional vision, not led by fear. The question is whether Europe is capable of that now. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think that you very well made a point that human rights are being decreasing in Europe, and you brought out 4 areas: migration, counterterrorism, human rights defenders, as well as economic and social rights as the examples. And I see a theme of what are the core rights that should be always protected rising up from this discussion. So this is perhaps the way that we will go later. But last but not least, our 5th panelist is Daniel Mitov, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bulgaria. He served there as from 2014 until 2017. He also has worked at the National Democratic Institute in the US as the head of the Political Party Development Program in Iraq and representative in Brussels. He has also represented the Institute in Libya, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ukraine, Yemen, Tunisia, and elsewhere. He has also worked at the Political Academy for Central and Southeast Europe and participated in many international programs. So Daniel, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction. And first I would like, of course, to thank the organizers for the honor of being here with you and the possibility to share a few thoughts. We talked about beforehand whether we should speak from the spot or stand up. My reflex from the last years is when I stand up, I prepare myself for a 40-minute speech, which will be a clear violation of all your human rights. Yes. So I'll try to limit myself into the 7 minutes. And I usually tend to go back to, in analysis like this, usually tend to go back to the beginning of the 90s and the fall of the Berlin Wall. The idea back then was that democracy and human rights have no other alternative. We just need to spread them somehow. And gradually, little by little, those two concepts, democracy and human rights, will win its way everywhere around the world. But we chose as a vehicle for that the free market. So basically it was, the concept was free market, and through free market, democracy and human rights little by little will penetrate the environment in the autocratic societies or societies with autocratic tendencies, and will create a natural push from the bottom up to from the citizens to the politicians to liberalize little by little their own environment. That was probably the case in the beginning because of the fact that there was a strong Western community, strong democratic community, which was ready not only to raise up its voice, but also to implement even force. We all remember the concept for the concept for responsibility to protect. Whenever we see human rights violations, there was this concept that we, the West, those who are defenders of the human rights, we have the responsibility to protect, to go there, to do something about it, to stop the madness. Well, recently, unfortunately, some of the problems were mentioned: weaponized corruption, shady business, money laundering. Actually made their way through the free market concept and poisoned somehow us, and failed to make those countries who have authoritarian tendencies to respect better human rights. So my first and initial instinct is we need to first look at ourselves. Those countries who champion human rights need to really look inside our legislative and political frameworks and put in order our own house and get rid of certain type of undesired effects from this communication with different environments, which is also influencing our own environment. The true realism, because very often we speak about realpolitik in international relations, that is, the true realism in international relations is to realize that when countries interact in the international scene, they exchange experiences in how their institutions function, in how their political environment functions, how their economies function. And turns out we are not immune, the democracies, we are not immune to bad practices which come from other places. Russia and Turkey are only part of the narrative. Look at the Philippines, look at other places. Human rights are increasingly being neglected, and at the expense of concepts like national sovereignty, national interest, and strategic trade deals. These who already violate human rights did not have a champion before in the beginning of the 90s and even in the beginning of the 2000s. But now they do. They do have, look at Kremlin, look at other places. Communist International, little by little, is being replaced with Anti-Democracy International. And those who want to increase their authoritarian tendencies, they have found their champion who will defend them on international scale. Of course, human rights will be always in jeopardy if there is no strong and united community of countries which is ready to defend them on a global scale. That is our task today. We need to reunite again the community of countries which are ready to live up to those standards and defend them on global scale, and start drawing clear lines between the others. There is no system on global level which could enforce human rights or define standards for sanctions even at least. Contemporary autocracies have developed the narrative that universal human rights are a Western invention and are not compatible culturally with different environments. Of course, there is a way to escape responsibility and preserve power, but in the meantime, we need to develop a clear message connecting in an obvious manner the respect for human rights and increased living standard. We have not done that yet. Human rights, respect for human rights, means increased living standards, better conditions. And the countries where human rights are fundamentally respected still continue to be a magnet for migration. So people know, and people know that preserving human rights is a good thing, and they strive for that, but the disregard for human rights stems very often from political elites. The latter, sometimes being incapable of governing, see the solution of social problems through the lens of limiting citizens' rights. And that turns out to be the easiest way for the demagogues and those who lack expertise to govern. And human rights defenders, as it was already mentioned by David, have not yet developed a vision for a positive narrative. Among the promoters of human rights, there probably needs to be a conversation about prioritized gradual persistence on establishing first the fundamental rights, and then that will slowly open up the conversation about others. But how do you promote something when there's no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of assembly, there's no freedom of almost anything? Human rights and the institutions of liberal democracy go hand in hand. This is my deepest conviction. In most of the cases, those institutions have been developed precisely in order to preserve human rights. Our Western institutions have been developed around preserving human rights and the concept for it. Judiciary and the rule of law are of particular importance in this case, and democracy promotion means also the promotion of human rights. The development agenda of the UN is full of good governance practices which have nothing to do with cultural specificities. Transparency, accountability, rule of law, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, those are good governance practices, and all the other narrative that this is Western influence and is not compatible with the environment of someone else is just a way to escape responsibility and do something else. So we need a serious conversation around this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel, for bringing out the issue of starting from the member states themselves and European institutions instead of looking generally at global issues. And I think that the point on human rights institutions and their importance is very well taken. Now I propose that we will leave some room for reflections. I will ask each of the panelists for 2 or 3 minutes, perhaps reflect on the ideas you heard, but also there might be 2 keywords that you take into account. First, what is this universality? Are there minimum core rights that form the basis of human rights? And also, do we need extension or expansion of the human rights language? And secondly, perhaps we should rather talk about European values and European human rights instead of global and universal human rights. So 2 to 3 minutes, each of the panelists have the time, and then we will take the first round of questions, so prepare yourself also. So Francois, please.
Yes, many things have been said. It's a source of very inspiring thoughts. But I would say 3 things in echo to what I heard. The first is that one should be clear on the fact that not all rights are human rights. And that's very important to keep in mind the fact that the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and those who have elaborated the later conventions wanted to make a body of specific rights, specific laws, that should be subject to interpretations, as it has been said, but should be above the others. And there is a constant temptation to say that any right is a fundamental right. And I think one should question this word of fundamental right. It's a basement of the edifice. And that's very, very important not to compromise. I know that there is a debate in Estonia regarding access to internet. It might be you are extremely advanced on that. Is it a fundamental right? I'm not sure that it goes with human dignity. In some other countries, people could consider that access to cars is a fundamental right. I think that one should preserve a hierarchy, and it's very difficult also to hierarchize between the human rights and fundamental rights because they all are necessary for the human dignity. Who could say that the lungs are more important than the kidneys or the kidneys of the heart? We need all that. We need all that to be alive. So it's the same with fundamental rights. There is no dignity without the full respect of the 30 articles. The second quick remark, but we will come back on that. For me, it's very clear that one should not accept to say or to let's say that human rights are Western values. First, human rights are not values, they are rights, and they are not Western. Just go in Africa, just go in Latin America or elsewhere, everywhere in the world, see victims, meet people victims of torture, and ask them if they consider it's a Western values that they invoke. It's simply their own dignity, and one should not give up on this neo-colonial trial that's made to us. And the last remark is that after having tried to promote what we have in common before our differences, and this was the movement which led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We might belong to different origins, different latitudes, different cultures, different religions, but we have some things in common, incumbent to the fact that we are part of the human family. But now what I can see in the world and in our societies is the exact reverse movement. People promoting their differences before the similarities. And this is very dangerous.
Thank you, Francois. Now, Jacob, please.
Yes, I'd actually head down a bit the same way as Francois, because I think that the human rights movement sometimes contributes to sort of a human rights fatigue by what we could call human rights inflation. So if you look back through the decades, you know, there's an increase of treaties, resolutions, and so on that is, you know, really, I wrote about it in Foreign Affairs some years ago. I don't remember the numbers anymore. But basically, if any country was to respect and implement all the binding norms, and if you then take sort of the non-binding norms, right? I mean, it would basically mean that your constitution looked like your tax code, which cannot be the idea of human rights, and which does not contribute to the rule of law. I would also say that if you take the European Court of Human Rights, the European Convention, which it secures, played, of course, a very important role in supporting the democratization, institution of rule of law in the Central and Eastern European countries that became part of the Council of Europe after the fall of the war. But if you look at some of the case law from the European Court of Human Rights, I think it has been guilty in trivializing some human rights. Take an example. In Italy, there was a town, a region, where for a number of months, garbage wasn't being picked up. And this is, of course, very unpleasant if you live in a town where garbage isn't being picked up. But the European Court of Human Rights said this was a violation of the right to family life and private life. The same with a woman who was living in Valencia. She lived in a place where there were clubs and bars that played loud music. This was also found to be a violation of her right to privacy and family life. And when you take these cases and then compare them to what's going, you know, with anti-terrorism laws or what's going on in Hungary, Poland, and other places, then, you know, I would be very happy if I was a dictator to say, oh yeah, okay, we violated Article 8 on private life and family life, but, you know, so did Spain because they had bars that played music until 3 o'clock in the morning. So there is this danger of decay from the inside as well as from the outside when the human rights movement is not sufficiently focused. And also you see it at the UN. If you look at the special procedures, so these mandates at the Human Rights Council, where you have independent experts looking at countries or thematic issues, which again, this is something that I wrote about in Human Rights Quarterly some years ago. I don't remember the numbers anymore. But when we looked at it last, which was the country that had proposed the most special procedures? It was Cuba. And what were these were sort of the rights of international solidarity and other things that could mean anything to anybody, and which took very valuable resources and time away from exactly scrutinizing countries like Cuba and European countries for that matter on freedom of association and so on. So I think this idea of the ever-extending scope of human rights basically undermines it. The difficult question is, of course, then to agree on what's the core, where is the limit. We're probably never gonna be agreeing on that, but I think we can stop and take stock for a moment without expanding it further.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. Now, Nele, please.
Yes, just going on with the same idea. Yes, probably there is a core. The core is everything that goes around the notion of human dignity, everything which is concerned with human dignity as being a human. I would like to have a food, I would like to have a place to live somewhere, etc., etc. There is a core which is related to the notion of human dignity, which should be protected despite where and when you are. And of course, not to be tortured is probably the most important one. And there are, of course, yes, human rights where we can argue whether this in one culture means one thing and in other culture it means another thing. Because as the usual sentence there, Russia says, for example, if against he has lost a case in the European Court of Human Rights, he's saying that human rights are Western rights. We are only a small part in Europe, as recently I heard somewhere a statistic that 70% of Russians consider them not to be Europeans. So why do we have to accept these Western values that Strasbourg is saying to us? But where are the limits? Yes, this is not an easy question. Then there is no clear answer. If I would know it, I would be win a Nobel Prize probably.
Yeah, thank you, Nele. David.
Yeah, thanks. So I mean, first of all, on this question of minimum core rights, I think we need to be very careful here because this can take us down a dangerous path where human rights becomes an a la carte menu for governments to choose their favorite bits and neglect the rest. And we quickly come into questions of relativism and the alignment of rights with traditional values. It opens the door to abuse. And so I think we need to hold on to the indivisibility and the universality of rights as articulated in the Universal Declaration. Jakob's point about the proliferation and the growth of human rights law is a different debate, and I'm hesitant to weigh into that one too much as a non-lawyer. I'll leave my more expert colleagues to say more. But we've seen the implications of this in Asia, particularly with the Asian values kind of discussions and narrative from many leaders, which in practice has been a way of abdicating responsibility for human rights. And it's been used by governments in a way to to project values when the populations, the people who are suffering, experiencing human rights violations, use the narrative, the discourse of human rights themselves to articulate the challenges that they experience and the expectations that they have of the state. So this is essentially a fancy way for governments to abdicate responsibility. The question, I think, comes in around the application of rights. You know, we can't treat the human rights framework as something which was ossified in 1948. The kinds of challenges that we face in the world today are different from those. We heard a lot about that in the previous panel in the area of technology. You know, this is raising new questions which human rights needs to grapple with very carefully. Your second point about European values, should we be talking about that instead? Well, I mean, yes, we should, in my perspective, but from the perspective of alignment rather than equivalence. You know, it's important. I think we're all clear that it's important for us to be making the case for human rights at a time when we're seeing rollbacks in so many different ways. And one of the ways of doing that is by talking about the alignment with value structures, value frameworks, including in Europe. And a final reflection is that we have said a little bit about whether human rights are first and foremost a legal edifice or about values. We have different perspectives on that, perhaps, on this panel. But I think I would want to say that the human rights movement is rich in its diversity. It's a community of lawyers, but also of journalists and of community activists. And leaders, and we need to think about how we can sort of use the blend of the legal rights and the value frameworks and so forth in the most creative way possible to advance human rights.
Thank you. And after Daniel's intervention, then we will ask for questions. Please.
Thank you very much. I'll try to limit my intervention. I said most of what I wanted to say.
Yes.
Just to agree with the colleagues about the centrality of the concept of human dignity. That is something, that is a concept which could be found almost at the core of every single cultural environment, and it is understood in different ways, but you can always arrive there. It is not by chance that it is mentioned so many times in the human rights, the UN Charter for Human Rights. That is the core, and I've experienced it personally arguing with a colleague of mine, I'm not going to mention who, but there was this issue about gay marriage and how the West is trying to promote gay marriage. I told him, no, look, the problem is that you are reading it this way and you're trying to find out reasons not to implement certain things. Gay marriage there's no consensus even in the West about this. And it is a very different issue. We are not promoting that, but human dignity is something that you need to look at, because people with their differences, no matter whether they are in one or another area, they have their dignity which needs to be preserved. And you're not supposed to imprison those people, you're not supposed to persecute them, or to create, I don't know what kind of units and teams, paramilitary or I don't know what else, in order to hunt them down or stuff like that. So basically, this is something which we need to use at the centrality, and I very much agree with all the other colleagues who mentioned that. And again, I would like to emphasize the UN development agenda, which is literally underlining all good governance practices which defend and stem from respect for human rights. It's an intertwined agenda which basically promotes good governance practices which at the same time are supposed to protect fundamental rights, and those have nothing to do with Western promotion of Western values or anything else. Accountability, transparency, rule of law, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, they guarantee human rights basically without anyone being legitimate to say that it's Western values being promoted here and there.
Thank you, Daniel. And now let's take 3 to 4 questions, and then the panel, whoever wants to respond to whichever questions can do it. Can I see any hands? Yes. Here, please.
Thank you very much. As member of the European Parliament, I'd like to share my experience and concerns about advocating for human rights all over the world. I've been one member who has been dealing with so-called urgencies on occasion of every plenary session, like next week. We have opportunity to address 2 urgency problems: human rights violations, wars, imprisonment of people, and our general approach, theoretically, is mainstreaming human rights in our relations with third countries. And the other element is conditionality. That is, we can proceed in our economic and political relations dependent on clear progress of human rights in a certain country. Now, this approach has been very selective. We are criticizing small, not so significant countries, bashing them, and at the same time, in our relations with China, yes, human rights dialogue is provided in our summit meetings, but it's done differently. And our diplomats feel that they are very courageous if they are just daring to raise issues like that separately from the mainstream problems. And I think this is a very big issue, practically, because by now 150 Tibetans have self-immolated themselves. It's an absolutely desperate outcry about the lack of their rights. Has there been any reaction in the democratic states? No. Iran. We are criticizing executions in some countries, but since 2 years ago, when the nuclear deal was concluded and Iran markets opened, then we're just ignoring that people are being hanged every day and every month. During the so-called moderate President Rouhani, who was re-elected, 3,500 people have been hanged in Iran, including young people, women. No reaction by the European Union. We are taking our representative Mogherini next week to task because we have debate on Iran and progress. But this is the situation. And so I would like to point out how much we need a unified approach to these problems, because otherwise, in case of Iran, it reminds me of old Lenin's saying that these capitalists are so greedy that they are prepared to sell us the very rope by which we are going to hang them.
Thank you. Any questions? I was thinking that this is perhaps a very interesting debate that we have. It is, of course, but it is also perhaps quite wide, so that perhaps it is difficult to ask specific questions. But I very much agree with the last point, and perhaps let's build upon it. So different treatment of different states. So Western state criticizing human rights violations in some areas, but at the same time neglecting a number of human rights violations in other states. My own research around children's rights actually proved the same, that the committee, United Nations Committee on the Rights of a Child, would criticize the African states for child marriages at the same time when all European Union member states have also possibilities for children getting married at an earlier age than 18. So there is this double standards. Any comments on that? And perhaps any comments on the ideas that we presented before? Yes, Jacob.
Well, I think part of the crisis of human rights, if we agree on that terminology, has to do with a geopolitical shift. And when liberal democracies were seen as basically the only game in town, then it had much more economic, cultural, and of course also, let's be honest, military power to affect things. I'll give a good example of the shift. You know that in Denmark we like to publish provocative cartoons in newspapers. In the 1960s, there was a Danish newspaper that published a very unflattering cartoon of Chairman Mao, and the Chinese embassy went berserk. They went to our prime minister and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and our prime minister told them, we don't care. I mean, you can complain all you want. We have a free press in Denmark. And then they complained again. The message was the same. Fast forward to 2012. We have a state visit from the Chinese president. And what happens? Danish police remove pro-Tibetan demonstrators, Falun Gong demonstrators, confiscate Tibetan flags and symbols. And why? It's all been investigated now, but there's clear evidence that this was a systematic effort. We don't know exactly who gave the order, but it's clear it's because the geopolitical situation has shifted. Under Chairman Mao, China was a basket case. It was a country that imploded. There was no economic interest. Now China is a huge global player, and Western states are in a much more defensive situation, and that obviously affects human rights. And then when the West is being perceived also as weak, it also becomes much less appealing. Then you can start painting human rights and democracy as a sign of decay. And that gives resonance when European countries are bickering or do not stand up for their own values.
Yeah, Daniel.
Just very quickly again, this very well, your comment, sir, was entirely within what I meant in the beginning, and Jacob continued it. What I meant in the beginning, that human rights are basically a hostage of concepts like national interest or national sovereignty or strategic trade deals. We observe this every single day when politicians in power use strategic trade deals or national interests. Usually they mean we're going to get some money from somewhere. And we don't care what's happening in that country because they're going to give us something to build a road, to build a bridge. They will invest in a oil refinery or something like that, or gas infrastructure. So basically, this is this has become so viral that we need to reflect again. As I said, we need to turn our gaze towards ourselves and figure out how to balance all that. I cannot help but remember also the migration crisis. It is very difficult because I was foreign minister exactly when a migration crisis in Europe was so strong that we figured out that at a certain point we had no strategy. We had nothing. The Europeans saw their leaders incapable of controlling the borders of the European Union or the borders of their own countries, and became worried. And that gave, of course, force to populist narratives and so on and so forth. So the balance between assuring the security of your citizens and preserving human rights is extremely difficult when you're a decision maker and you're trying to make the choices. We need to develop an agenda on that. We need to develop a narrative on that, which we don't have. And at a certain point, we see all this complete and utter talk in disarray from different states in different places, and of course the greed you're talking about, the special interest, and I will mention again the weaponized corruption by certain autocrats is a real danger for the European Union especially, but also for the West in general. You can always find someone who will take the suitcase or something like, or whatever is done there. Offshore zones. We need to rethink of how we deal with such untransparent zones through which major corruption schemes are going through. The Council of Finance Ministers of the European Union took some first steps with those grey lists which they have developed, but this is nothing. I hope this is just the first step. These are questions which influence directly human rights.
Francois.
Yes, I very much agree with what has been said regarding the consistency, the coherence, and the double standards. I think we have to realize how demanding and how fragile is this very notion of universality. And it sets back when, in the name of relativism, culturalism, other regions, other cultures, they invoke special human rights for their citizens. But it also can be in our camp. If, for example, in the name of a very legitimate right, which is to defend our safety, we authorize torture and create Guantanamo, this completely affects our credibility and our words and our, the efficiency of universality of human rights in the international multilateral arenas. And it's very difficult to be consistent. It is true for Europe, it is true for all of our countries. This is where we have to do our best to strategize human rights, to be as demanding as possible, and also to be conscious that, as I said, we are not talking of a moral. We are not in the lofty ideals of ethics. We are dealing with concrete issues. So at the end of the day, what matters is what is the most efficient for the victim of violations. And I don't think that just naming, blaming, shaming, it can be a tool, but it cannot be the only one, and it cannot be definitely the one of states and international institutions. Because we have to view our relationship in the long term, and because one should be very arrogant to consider that la voix de la France, the voice of France, for example, would be enough to influence countries far with whom we have no relations. So the difficulty is to combine our ideals, our visions, our goals, and to create interdependence. Because if you have words, if you blame countries or systems with whom you have no relation at all, what is your influence? It's only narcissism. You please yourself, you have the right posture, you feel that you embody the right camp, but at the end of the day, it's not useful. For in these cases, the difficulty dwells in the necessity to create interdependence in all means, and thanks to this independence, to have a discourse and have an action on human rights, and only the result matters.
Thank you. I saw a question here, and are there any? Yes, I saw you, and there is also a third hand. Very good. Let's come first here, and let's collect the questions, and then let's reflect on it. Yes.
Hi, yes, there is a question that has been nagging me since...
Could you please introduce yourself also?
Yeah, my name is Pablo Beirat, I'm a journalist. There's a question that has been nagging me since the refugee crisis in 2015 began, and it's the question of the populist. And it's related, I think, to how we might have taken for granted the idea of human rights. And it is the following: how do we explain people suffering hardship in Europe that they have to care about the rights of others? How do we explain a long-term, how do we explain a person suffering hardship in Europe that they need to care about the rights of others?
Yes.
How do we explain someone who has been unemployed for a few years already, is in risk of losing his or her home, that they need to care about refugees? And of course the answer is human dignity, but how do we make this easy to understand for someone who is in a very hard situation?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Then we had a question back there. Yes, and then.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Jiang Tianzi. I'm from China, and I'm really appreciated and respect the discussions about China. And in terms of the Chinese situation, I would like to say that as a Chinese citizen, I feel like too little done, too much to be done in terms of human rights. However, I have a question: is that how did you or panelists think about the idea that human rights is another right in terms of the international relations? It's a kind of leverage. It's kind of leverage that on the international business that you can be trade, you can be, for just a few examples, I just refers to some media that such as BBC or CNN, that for example in the past few months that when Chinese president visit the Europe and few countries mention of human rights, and particularly, of course, I would like to ask Mr. Daniel, how do you think about this, and how is your country's when dealing with human rights with Iran, North Korea, and in terms of such issues? And second, I really personally am really curious. For example, the events happens in Spain. That I think that nowadays there's a few discussion about on the Spain, and how is your panelists think about is kind of people nowadays just intentionally avoid the situation happen in Spain, and or it is just it's just gone. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And we had also a third question in the middle there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the very inspiring debate. My name is Alexander Antonov. I'm an intern at the German Embassy here in Tallinn. I have a rather legal question. When we think about the point when human rights are already breached, I wonder, for example, in Crimea, when we think about the Tatars' rights, which are breached by the Russians, from a legal point of view, do you think that international law provides the tools to establish individual culpability for state leaders that actually lead to pursue these kind of policies that lead to the breaches of human rights? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 4 questions: how to justify protection of human rights to people in need and suffering, human rights as leverage, is that the way that it should be looked? Then the Spanish question, human rights and Spain, and lastly, does international law have suitable means to tackling human rights violations such as Crimea? Anyone? Nele, and then Francois.
I can start with some of the questions. How to explain people living, for example, in Estonia or in Latvia, whatever country, who are in bad situation, why do we have to help those ones who are coming from Africa? If to use this so-called Murphy slogan, it's easy to say them, if you think you are in a bad situation, don't worry, it can be worse. So maybe this is the explanation. You feel that you are in a really bad situation, but there is a possibility that there are people who are more bad situation. So, yeah, but becoming serious, to explain seriously, it's not an easy task, as it was also in Estonia, for example. Why do we have to help Greece, where during the economic crisis, if the pensions and salaries are much higher than in Estonia? Why do we pay their loans? It's not comparable to the refugee question, but the substance of the question is the same. Probably the most practical solution is that those people who have already got their refugee status should like explain what is the reality to be in Africa during the war, in Syria, etc., etc., just to explaining. Probably there is no other way. Are there enough international tools to rectify the violation of human rights? As we all know that the European Convention human rights system is the best one probably in the world to tackle these issues, because there is a mechanism where to turn to, and there will be judgments that will be implemented, at least most of them. However, I would like to, I'm not directly answering to the question, but I would like to point out that recently I have a lot thought about the new international instrument, for example, the Convention for the Protection of Disabled Persons, or the optional protocol for the against torture. Both of them conventions foresee that there should be some kind of national mechanism at the place in the member states in order to fight against the violations. And in my opinion, these international instruments that oblige the member states to set up national instruments, mechanisms in order to fight these violations on the root level are the best ones.
Yeah, thank you. Just, I will limit your speeches to 2 minutes. Yes, Francois, and then David.
Okay, on just two questions. First, how to explain the refugees and the newcomers. First, I think to explain, you have to be convinced. So the first, I would say, the first thing is how to be convinced of the privilege we have to live in a space where human rights are basically respected, even if there are ups and downs, and it can depend on the moment and the country. We have to refine to reinvent a kind of European pride based on that. And we have to be very clear that if we consider that our moral duty and the human duty is to open the doors of our house, the only condition is not to destroy the house. And the pillar of this house, the walls and the pillars, are these fundamental principles on which our society are based: women's rights, democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, LGBT's rights, etc., etc. And if we are convinced of that, proud of that, it will be very simple to explain and to say, you are welcome. The only thing we ask you is that here it's a prerequisite to pay respect to these basic values of our societies. This is just on this aspect. On the trade, the question regarding trade, I think the question is not should we trade with this or this country, but how should we trade? Trade can be a vehicle, a very good vehicle for respect and human rights as well. It depends what you sell, in which condition, how it is produced, is it respectful to the consumers' public health, is it and one should put respect on the product in the market, and the European norms are in fact norms of respect. And I think that at the beginning, in our history, the concept of human rights has been carried by individuals in a first, and most of these individuals have ended as witches in the fire, very courageous. And after World War II, it has been carried by states and institutions, and later with major NGOs and foundations, we became major players. And I think that now we are entering a new era where a new player is coming in the scene of human rights, which is the business sector. So, of course, they all overlap. We still have courageous people, we still have states and institutions, we still have important NGOs. But I think now it's like a rocket with different steps. And now we should involve the business sector and the financial sector in promotion of human rights. Because if they will care of that, how my shirt with on my T-shirt €3 has been product. I've been in the Rana Plaza which collapsed in Bangladesh. I will never forget the faces and the looks of the victims I met who were just amputated. So I think that if we are able to put ethics and respect on the product, in the products, on the market, we have a strong leverage for improvement of human rights.
Thank you, David, and then Daniel.
Thanks. Just a couple of reflections. First, on this question of how do we expect people who are themselves suffering hardships to show solidarity towards refugees? Well, I mean, the first thing to do, speaking as a representative of an NGO here, is that we need to show that we care about the plight of those who are suffering from austerity measures and whose economic rights are being infringed, as we do about refugees. As I said in my talk earlier on, I think if you go to the Greek islands, it's not okay to talk about the refugees only and to ignore entirely the plight of the local population as well. But equally, I think we need to combat the narrative that this is somehow a zero-sum game, that care for refugees and welcoming refugees into Europe is somehow detracting from the quality of life of European citizens. In reality, we find the pie often grows. It's not that you have a smaller slice, it's that you have a thinner slice of a bigger pie, perhaps. And in that sense, it's important to highlight the success stories of refugees and migrants who've contributed in very rich ways to the culture, to the economy, to the society of the countries where they have eventually found themselves. And I think the other point I would make around this is the need to emphasize the welcoming narratives that often exist within European societies. This is making the case here is not in rights terms, rights language alone is not going to work. It's not going to be persuasive. But actually, we see how extraordinarily welcoming the Greek populations have been on the islands. We've seen how Europeans from across the continent have given up work and gone to volunteer on landing places to offer their skills as medics or others. There is an extraordinary willingness among European people to help. And the sort of familiarity with people, once you meet and encounter refugees, that breeds a sense of trust, a sense of responsibility towards them, and the human solidarity element kicks in. I would also just like to mention briefly, Amnesty is in the middle of promoting the model of community sponsorship as a model for welcoming refugees into Europe. It's been deployed successfully in Canada so far. And when communities take responsibility for families, for paving the way for them, for integrating them into a community, there's an extraordinary outpouring of generosity that comes with that. So I think there are lots of ways that we can make that case.
Thank you. Daniel?
First, on the question, how do we explain? Of course, a lot has been said. The only thing I can mention here is what really happened during the refugee crisis in Europe was to say to our citizens, look, the first thing we need to do is to establish certain rules, which we didn't have until this moment. We needed to develop them during the crisis itself. How to secure the borders, how to cooperate with our neighbors, how to cooperate with European Union's neighbors in order to control the process. And we have different responsibilities towards refugees and towards economic migration, economic migrants. Those are two different categories of people with separate rights, with separate needs, and so on. We are obliged to help the refugees. We need to do everything possible in order to help them. Probably this will trigger disagreements, but the refugee status is not forever. We need to do everything possible in order to bring peace to the countries where they have been driven from. And then, of course, all these people, most of these people, they look forward to going back and reconstructing their own countries, their own society. They love their countries. They earn for, they desire to go back and reconstruct and live a normal life. They love their homeland. So this is understood by most of the European citizens, and I think this is the way to go and try to give some type of explanation. If I understood correctly, the next question was, what is the leverage over those who disrespect human rights, and how do we react, how Bulgaria reacts? Well, Bulgaria usually condemns certain violations of human rights, as a lot of others. And the problem is that right now we don't have a clear champion of human rights in the West. We have lost that. The European Union even is not a clear champion for human rights. We speak about them, but we tend to neglect certain things. The US, we see right now what's going on. So we need to restore a certain type of championship in that area. And draw conclusions from the consequences when we lost sight of preservation of human rights. And the leverage is mostly economic. So we need to be clear that whenever we have violations of human rights, the leverage we have is to start and to develop clear set of rules what and how we should react first in economic terms. But the concept which I very much liked in the past, which was a responsibility to protect, was completely lost. We forgot about it. We have no system in the international, and this is the third question, we have no system in the international environment, the international framework of how to react when a country not only violates human rights, but there's already countries who completely and utterly disregard international law. Crimea is the classic example for that, but there are many other cases beforehand, and others are trying right now to continue along that path, because they think, well, if there's no consequences, why shouldn't I do that, or why shouldn't another group of countries do that? So we need to start drawing lines. The world, whether we want it or not, the world is divided again, and we need to realize that, and we need to react accordingly. And we need to stand on a clear side and say, this is who we are, this is what we promote, this is what we want for the rest of the humanity, and we are going to stand firm on that. And even if we economically lose something, we need to, it is human rights and values and everything else first, and then everything else.
Jacob. Thank you, David.
Yeah, on Spain, I think I don't take any position on pro-independence or not, and I'm certainly not an expert on it. I think what happened on the election day, I think there were clearly examples of disproportionate use of violence by Spanish authorities. I don't think anyone can disagree on that. I'm not an expert on Spanish law, but my understanding is that some of these politically elected Catalonian leaders are basically being held in prison on demand on something on charges of something akin to sedition or rebellion. And I think that at least raises the question of whether this is a disproportionate response to basically a peaceful desire for independence, whether that independence is illegal or not under Spanish and international law. But I think the reason why people are so quiet in Europe is because the specter of an independence movement in one of Europe's biggest country freaks everyone out. And especially coming on the back of Brexit, people would rather say, okay, let's look the other way, and they can handle this themselves, because we don't want to be seen as giving support to an independence movement, because this will fracture all of Europe. But again, we have to be able to look at this principle. The Spanish state obviously has to live up to its human rights obligation, and you can say that without giving support to the to independence of Catalonia. I think that's the position you have to take.
Thank you. I will now use my right as a moderator to pose one final question to you all. European Convention on Human Rights allows for limitation of human rights when it's necessary in a democratic society. My question to you is whether the terrorist threats, as well as all kind of liberation movements, religious diversity in Europe, has shifted the meaning of what is necessary in today's society to somewhere else where it used to be in comparison 10, 20 years ago. And what you see might be the limits of this, what can be necessary in a democratic society. You each have 1 minute to respond, and I will start with Francois, and then we will come back to this line. Because you are a lawyer, and you know.
Okay, in 1 minute.
Yes, sorry.
Okay. I think that the limit is a key word for human rights. It all does with limits. And when I think about limits, I think about the French writer Albert Camus. Albert Camus, in all his work, he was thinking about what is the limit for a legitimate cause to be defended. And he did that from 1940, letter to a German friend, to 1968, Chronique Algérienne. And I remember one of his plays, Les Justes, the writers. There is a very interesting moment. I will just focus on this. Some activists, it's in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. They want abolition of slavery. They are idealists. And they want to kill a dignitary, and they plan a coup, and they decide to throw a bomb on a carriage with horses. And they discuss between them in the play, and they say, you will do that, okay, they make the plan. And the D-Day arrives, and the guy comes back, and he said, I have not, why? And the other say, why didn't you throw the bomb? And he said, because at the last moment, I saw a child in the carriage. Ah, you saw a child, okay. But you should go, our cause is more important than this child. We have a right cause. And he said, okay, I will try tomorrow. But what if the child appears tomorrow again? And he said, if I see the child again tomorrow, I will not throw the bomb. Because I'm an activist, I don't want to be a killer. Je ne veux pas être un assassin. So I think this is a very question of limits. One should set limits, and one should be very clear on the fact that not all the means are legitimate to defend even a fair cause. And this is the base, and we have to be very clear on that. And I say that it can be obvious, it can sound obvious, but it is not. There is a lot of comprehension for people at some moments that use violent moment, and this is true for activists, this is true for states as well.
Thank you, Francois. Jacob.
That was not an easy,
Sorry.
narrow question. Well, I think that Europe is finding out that you could say diverse societies are more difficult to get to function than we had thought, and that human beings are not always motivated by abstract ideas and principles, and maybe we have sort of based some of our models on the idea that we would act in such a way. So I think there's a huge task in front of many European states in how do we ensure that in diverse societies we can live together and based on the basic principles of liberal democracies and the rule of law. And I think that is it will take time, and I think things may have to get worse before they get better, unfortunately.
Thank you, Jacob. Nele.
Necessary in democratic society, whether this has changed. Of course it has changed. if the aim to protect the society is more pressing, it's clear that more limits to human rights are needed. However, on the other hand, we also have to take account that the knowledge of human rights has arisen, and also the standards for the positive obligation of states has arisen. So we expect more from the state to do in order to protect, on the other hand, the whole society, on the other hand, also the human rights. So this is the balancing test, and now it's up to the legislator whether to opt for really detailed casuistic norms to find the right balance, or still stay on abstract level and rely, again, coming back to the to my presentation, or to rely on judges to find the most just solution in the concrete place, concrete time, what is necessary.
Thank you, Nele. David, only 30 seconds maximum. Sorry.
Yep. I would just say, let's be careful what we wish for. One very flippant example, yesterday I opened my laptop just after coming out of the shower and then promptly closed it again because I don't want the CIA to see me in my underwear. The mass surveillance systems that European and the US and other countries have put in place enables massive intrusion into our private lives. We have also seen much more serious examples in France earlier this year. A protest against an alleged rape by a police officer was banned under counterterrorism provisions. In Hungary, a man who threw a stone in the context of some rioting, protesting, but then picked up a megaphone and called on both sides for restraint, was sentenced to 10 years in jail. Is this the kind of society we want to live in? This is the question we have to ask.
Yes, thank you. Last but not least, 30 seconds.
Very quickly. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Very quickly, to me this question, the answer to it in the context of the European Union is literally more European integration and not less. So basically, when it comes to the security or increasing the security environment for the European citizens, the European Union can do so much in terms of integrating more, not only in the security sector, but right now there. The army integration, which is complementary to NATO efforts, is going on. This is a good thing. The focus on the outer borders of the European Union is also another specific thing. And I think the creation of a common European intelligence agency is something we need to strive for, to look for, because it turns out that all the cases of terrorist attacks which happened recently in Europe, at least one intelligence service in the European Union member states had information which either they failed to disseminate and share, or someone did not pay enough attention on the other side, even if it was shared and so on. So basically, this is something where we can. These are areas where we can look into and gain more out of that.
Thank you. I think that our panel deserves an applause. Yes. Just a moment.
Aitäh kõigile esinejatele väga huvitava arutelu eest. Ja kuna meil on juba liga 2 tundi meie lõunapausist möödas, siis ilmselt on vaja natuke jõudu kasutada. Ja selleks on nüüd kuni 5 minutit pärast 3, muidugi pärast lõunat, lõpeb meil kohvipaus ja siis me ootame kõiki teid siia saali tagasi. Aitäh!